chapter 28, section 2. It's called The New Frontier. And so we're talking about John F. Kennedy's role in the space race. And while, some of his ideas, he had an ambitious domestic spending program, kind of hearkening back to the New Deal. Some of those agendas were more controversial. But in particular, as we talk about the space race and many of his domestic goals, he accomplished a great deal in his short term as presidency. So, first off, the New Frontier is what he called his policies, his domestic spending plans. But he also had to face up against a strong Republican Southern Democrat coalition. So the Republicans were obviously against him, but also Southern Democrats were beginning to turn against the Democratic Party and increasingly join to the Republican Party. And really, Kennedy's no Roosevelt here. While he's popular and his legacy has continued to make him famous, and of course the tragic story of his assassination and the glamour of his family there's a million documentaries about the Kennedy family. But let's be honest, he's no Roosevelt. He didn't win his election with an overwhelming landslide. It was a very close race. And so, we look at these things when presidents are trying to get their agendas passed. If it's a close race, that's what we call a lack of a clear mandate. Mandate means that you have the overwhelming support of the American people. And Kennedy just did not. And so it made it more difficult for him to get some of his goals accomplished. But here's a few things that he faced. First off, the U.S. was in a recession in 1960. That meant our unemployment rate was climbing back to recession level percentages. So we're not quite at a Great Depression. A recession is kind of where we were about 10 years ago, where unemployment was becoming a serious concern. The economy was not growing to the degree that it should. And so you've got a couple of classic responses for this. Kennedy's going with the kind of the liberal progressive response by pushing for deficit spending. That is borrowing money to stimulate growth. Roosevelt tried that, Truman did that, and so forth. But also, we are talking about the Cold War here. Part of his plan for stimulating the economy was to increase spending on defense. And so by boosting defense-related industries, this would also hopefully generate money to create jobs. Now, one of Kennedy's great passions was to help. That we could actually increase our prestige abroad by sending folks to help in developing nations. The Peace Corps and the Alliance for Progress were not only philanthropic endeavors. In a way, they were meant to deter the spread of communism. So if you have a passion for helping people, particularly those in impoverished nations, you could consider one of these two programs. And, they're sponsored by the federal government. You go through a lengthy application process, and then you get to travel the world and help people and get paid to do it. Like any other government job, it's not going to make you rich, but it's a very rewarding career. And yes, it had a political purpose in stopping the spread of communism. Because if you can help these developing countries become sustainable without having to turn to, the emergency measures of communism, then you've done your part in the Cold War without having to hurt anyone. But of course, my favorite part of this lesson is the race to the moon. So the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man into space in April of 1961. And this was a major embarrassment to the United States. So the Soviets sent up the first satellite, Sputnik. The Soviets put the first person in space. Where are we going to get a win here? And, no one's fighting here. No one's dying, although the threat of the potential of an intercontinental ballistic missile also came with Sputnik. Okay, the threat of global espionage, the fact that we can send satellites over another country's airspace and there's very little they can do about it. Okay, those are military concerns. But there's also the scientific prestige that comes along with being the first group to the moon. And so Kennedy set the goal of landing on the moon before the end of the 1960s. Soon after the Soviets, we put a man into space. We also began to launch our own satellites. But in the summer of 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. And I have the privilege to show you the moon landing in just a moment. Now, as we start to think about the impact of this, it's incredible. We've now landed humans on another planetary body. We have now put people into outer space. We have the capacity to look beyond our sphere, and even now to look beyond our galaxy. And that's, just from a layman's perspective, it's incredible. And so from this, university and scientific programs have arisen. Of course, new technologies like we've talked about. Whole new industries revolve around this. And so here it is, the first moon landing.
2, 1, 0. All engine running. Down 2.5, picking up some gusts. 3 feet, 2.5 down. Take shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 6, 1.5. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LEM footpads are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. I'm going to step off the LEM now. It's 1 small step for man, 1 giant leap for mankind. I believe it, Charlie. It's raining, John. Look at it go, would you, Charlie? You got all your steering and it's straight. Oh, this is going to be some kind of different ride. Hippity hoppity, hippity hoppity, hippity hopping over hill and dale. Da 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 da. Hippity hopping along. 1, ignition. Burn away, Houston. Vector good. We're burning flight. Roger. Looks good, flight. How's that make shot, flight? Roger. Stand by for splashdown. Recovery, America, stable water, cruise call.
Now, earlier we discussed a book from Michael Harrington, The Other America, pointing out that for many the Great Depression never ended. And it brought attention to poverty in our nation. And several, passions or hopes of Kennedy was to begin nationwide work on addressing poverty, on racial injustice, and on civil rights. Of course, there were several goals of his that were not accomplished, some that he did not live to see the end of, some that are just still ongoing goals for the Democratic Party. For example, Medicare for the elderly. Well, his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president, will sign into law Medicare in 1965. The rebuilding of blighted areas, that is, increased funding for urban renewal projects or low-income housing, and federal aid for education, also funded and signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson through the Secretary of Education Act. And as I'm sure you all are aware, on November 22nd of 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was on tour of Dallas, Texas, attending a parade hosted by the governor of the state and allegedly Lee Harvey Oswald from a book repository, which is a book warehouse. He was on the top floor, I think the 8th floor if I remember correctly, shot from 1,000 yards away at a moving target, which seems impossible, but he was a military trained Marine sniper, and so he had the expertise to pull this off. Shot and hit President Kennedy in the back of the head from his moving convertible. Kennedy was taken to the hospital where he passed that night. Now, before Lee Harvey Oswald could face trial, he was actually shot point blank in public, moving from custody to the courthouse by a small-time mobster, Jack Ruby. Meanwhile, Lyndon Johnson succeeded JFK, was actually sworn into office aboard Air Force One. The Warren Commission studied this incident and in the initial investigation concluded that Oswald acted alone. Now, again, they were never able to secure Oswald's testimony, though there was some time to interrogate him behind closed doors. A reinvestigation was conducted several years later, which actually found that Oswald was part of a conspiracy. And now, again, this is a matter of great interest. There's movies about this. There's books about this. Netflix came out with a show about this based on a Stephen King novel. Again, it's something that people have studied to a great deal. And so here you get, the survey version. But again, it's something worth looking into. And for one of your group projects, you might want to consider this. And so, while Kennedy's presidency was controversial, his assassination was a national tragedy. And he left many unfulfilled goals, like the national assault on poverty that Johnson will wage, or a national investigation on racial injustice in the South, or a national civil rights bill, which again Johnson will sign into law with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Or even tax cuts to stimulate economic growth. So Kennedy's presidency was short. He won election in 1960. He was murdered just a few years later. But yet his legacy is powerful. And he's left this kind of enduring legacy as an idealist, but one that a lot of people look to for hope.